Rome called itself eternal, and for centuries, the world believed it. The city had withstood countless threats, rebellions, and invasions, yet its walls remained untouched. Poets sang of its invincibility, generals gloried in its victories, and citizens walked its marble streets with the confidence of belonging to the center of the world. But in 410 AD, that illusion collapsed when Alaric and his Visigoths breached the gates. The city that had stood for over 800 years as the beacon of civilization was suddenly vulnerable. For 3 days, the eternal city was at the mercy of outsiders. It wasn't just stone walls that cracked, but the very idea of Rome as invincible. The sack was more than a military event. It was a psychological earthquake that rippled across the known world. The empire had been weakening for decades before Alaric arrived at Rome's gates. Once fueled by endless conquests, Rome's machine of power had slowed. Corruption gnawed at the Senate. The military was stretched too thin, and emperors came and went in rapid succession, often chosen more by ambition than by competence. The Western Empire was already struggling to hold together its provinces, while the eastern half in Constantinople distanced itself from the chaos. In this fragile state, Rome was no longer the center of power it once was, and Alaric knew it. His arrival wasn't a random attack, but the culmination of years of frustration, broken treaties, and unmet promises. Alaric himself was no stranger to Rome. As a young man, he had served in the Roman military, fighting alongside legions and learning the empire's ways. He had tasted its wealth, seen its politics, and understood both its strength and its weaknesses. For years, he sought recognition from Roman leaders, asking for land and legitimacy for his people. But instead of honor, he was met with arrogance and neglect. Rome saw him as a tool, not a leader, and dismissed his demands. That arrogance would prove to be one of Rome's greatest mistakes, for it turned a potential ally into the very man who would lead the eternal city to its knees. The Visigoths themselves were a people caught between worlds. They were outsiders, yes, but they were also products of Rome's own expansion. Many had lived within the empire's borders, served as soldiers, and adopted aspects of Roman culture. Yet, they were never truly accepted. They wanted land to farm, a place to settle, and respect as equals rather than pawns. Rome's inability, or unwillingness to integrate them, created a volatile relationship. By 410, Alaric's people were desperate. They had marched across Italy, endured hunger, and seen negotiations collapse time after time. The sack of Rome was less about conquest and more about survival. When the Visigoth army finally surrounded the Eternal City, panic gripped its people. Refugees poured in from the countryside, swelling the population and straining supplies. The Senate, once a proud body of statesmen, debated endlessly, but found no solution. Some argued for paying Alaric off, others for resistance. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens prayed to gods who no longer seemed to answer. The Christian community sought solace in its bishops, while pagans whispered that abandoning the old gods had doomed the city. The atmosphere was one of dread. Not just fear of death, but fear that the gods themselves had abandoned Rome. The gates did not fall with thunderous assault, but with something quieter and more unsettling. Betrayal or surrender. Accounts differ, but the result was the same. The Visigoths entered the Eternal City. For 3 days, the world's greatest metropolis was theirs. Villas were plundered, treasures carried off, and streets filled with chaos. Yet, this was not a total destruction. Alaric had given orders to his men to respect churches, particularly the great basilicas of Peter and Paul. These became sanctuaries for the terrified, where thousands huddled together, protected by the sanctity of faith even amid collapse. Imagine walking those streets, where once triumphal processions marched under the arches of emperors. Now Visigoth soldiers rode through, their boots striking the same stones that had borne generations of senators, generals, and consuls. Statues of gods and emperors, once symbols of power, looked down silently as chaos unfolded below. Fires lit the night sky, the smoke mixing with the prayers of the desperate. For centuries, Rome had been the stage for victory. Now it was the theater of humiliation. Yet, even in this chaos, restraint was evident. Unlike the brutal sacks of other cities in history, Alaric seemed intent on making a statement rather than annihilating Rome. His men looted, Yes, but they did not burn the city to the ground. They took wealth, gold, and slaves. But much of Rome's physical structure remained. This was not about erasing the eternal city, but about breaking its aura of invulnerability. And in that sense, Alaric succeeded perfectly. Tissac wasn't about ending Rome physically, but spiritually. And that wound would never fully heal. For the Roman people, the psychological damage was worse than the physical. To live in Rome was to believe you were safe, protected by gods and legions alike. The idea that foreigners could march freely through its streets was unthinkable. People wept not only for their losses, but for the shattering of their identity. Rome was supposed to be eternal. Now, eternity felt fragile, even mortal. The city survived, yes, but it had been stripped of something deeper than gold. Its myth of invincibility. News of the sack spread like wildfire across the empire. In Constantinople, shock reverberated through the court, and distant provinces like Gaul and Britain. People asked if Rome could still protect them. Even enemies of the empire were stunned. For centuries, Rome had been the unshakable colossus. Now, it was vulnerable, human, breakable. Augustine of Hippo would later write that this event forced people to question the very foundations of their world. If Rome could fall, what else was truly eternal? The sack of Rome in 410 AD shocked not only the city itself, but the entire Mediterranean world. For centuries, Rome had been more than a capital. It was the symbol of order, stability, and civilization. When news spread that the eternal city had fallen to the Visigoths, distant provinces trembled. Merchants in North Africa wondered if their grain ships would still reach Rome's hungry Mesite. In Gaul and Hispania, whispers spread that perhaps the empire was no longer capable of defending its subjects. Even enemies of Rome paused to reflect on the magnitude of the event. If Rome, the city that had once conquered them all, could be humbled, then no power was truly beyond reach. The fall was not simply military. It was psychological, and its shockwaves extended far beyond the Tiber River. The cultural identity of Rome also took a devastating blow. Roman poets, historians, and philosophers had long written of their city's eternal nature. Virgil, centuries earlier, had called Rome the empire without end. That myth gave people comfort, a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. But when the Visigoths entered through its gates, looting its villas and terrifying its people, the myth cracked. Ordinary Romans were forced to confront a new truth. Their city was not immune to the decay that touched all human things. For writers of the time, this collapse inspired, was the empire still Rome? If its capital could be violated, was eternity ever real? Or just a story they told themselves? These questions would echo in Roman thought for generations. Religion became a battleground in the aftermath of the sack. Pagans quickly argued that the abandonment of traditional gods had doomed the city. To them, Rome fell because Jupiter, Mars, and the pantheon of old had been neglected. Christians countered by pointing out that their holy places were spared. The divine providence had guided Alaric's restraint. The sack thus became not just a political event, but a theological argument, forcing Romans to debate the true foundations of their society. Augustine of Hippo, living in North Africa, used the catastrophe as the backdrop for his monumental City of God, arguing that the fall of Rome was proof that earthly powers were temporary, while the kingdom of heaven endured. In this way, the sack shifted the spiritual axis of the empire as much as it reshaped its political identity. For the Roman elite, humiliation was bitter. Senators who once dictated policy to provinces found themselves powerless. Their villas stripped, their families terrified. Some fled to the Eastern Empire, hoping Constantinople still offered stability. Others retreated into nostalgia, writing of Rome's past glories rather than its bleak present. But the sack revealed more than their weakness. It exposed their detachment. For decades, the aristocracy had ignored the struggles of ordinary Romans, focusing on luxury and privilege. When the crisis came, they were unprepared to lead or protect. Their downfall was not just the result of Alaric's swords, but of their own negligence. The sack was as much an indictment of Rome's internal failings as it was of external threat. Among the common people, survival was the only concern. Families crammed into churches, clutching what little they could carry. Mothers tried to calm frightened children while listening to the foreign voices of soldiers outside. Merchants closed their shops, knowing that coins meant little when swords dictated the rules. The poor had always lived in Rome's shadows, but now their suffering was shared by everyone. For 3 days, rich and poor alike knew fear, hunger, and despair. In that sense, the sack was a great equalizer, reminding all Romans that beneath the layers of wealth and class, they were all vulnerable to history's tides. For some, the experience broke their faith in Rome entirely. For others, it bound them closer together in resilience. The sack also exposed the fragility of Rome's military system. Once, the empire's legions were the envy of the world, disciplined, loyal, and unstoppable. But by 410, many of those legions were gone, scattered across distant frontiers, or replaced by mercenaries with little loyalty to the empire itself. The soldiers left in Rome were too few, too unmotivated, and too poorly led to mount real resistance. Alaric's entry was not a glorious battle, but a collapse of willpower. For Rome, it was a humiliating reminder that empires are not defended by walls alone, but by people willing to stand behind them. And in 410, that will was gone. Beyond the immediate destruction, the sack marked a turning point in the empire's geopolitics. The Western Empire, already fragile, could no longer claim supremacy over Europe. Provinces that had once looked to Rome for leadership began to drift away, seeking local rulers or protection from emerging powers. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, grew in importance, eventually outlasting its Western counterpart by centuries. But for those in the West, the sack of Rome was a visible sign that their empire was entering its twilight. The Eternal City might survive in name, but its role as the unchallenged heart of the world was over. Ironically, Alaric himself did not live long after his greatest victory. Just months later, he died suddenly while leading his people south into Italy. Legend says his men buried him beneath a riverbed, hiding both his body and the treasures of Rome in the waters. Whether true or not, the story adds a haunting epilogue to his legacy. Alaric had shaken the world, humbled the Eternal City, and forced Rome to confront its mortality. Yet his own end came swiftly, a reminder that no conqueror escapes history's final judgment. His death, however, did not undo the transformation he had unleashed. In the years that followed, Rome continued to exist, but never again with the same aura. The sack had permanently broken the illusion of eternity. Its streets were rebuilt, its senators debated, and its emperors issued decrees. But everyone knew the truth. Rome could be touched, Rome could be humbled, Rome could fall. That knowledge alone changed the balance of the world. For citizens, it meant living with a fragile sense of identity. For outsiders, it meant opportunities to rise where once Rome had cast its shadow. The old order was gone, and a new, uncertain age had begun. Even today, when visitors walk among the ruins of Rome, the story of 410 lingers. The Colosseum still stands, the arches still rise, and the stones still whisper of glory. But behind those ruins lies the memory of vulnerability. The sack of Rome reminds us that no city, no empire, no matter how eternal it seems, is immune to time. It is both a tragedy and a lesson. That greatness is never guaranteed, that power must be nurtured, and that arrogance invites collapse. For Rome, the day the Eternal City burned was the day it truly became human, and in that humanity lies the reason its story continues to echo across the centuries. The sack of Rome in 410 did not mark the literal end of the Western Roman Empire, but it destroyed something even more precious: the aura of inevitability. For centuries, the empire had lived on reputation as much as on strength. Enemies often surrendered without fighting, believing resistance to Rome was futile. That spell was now broken. After Alaric's sack, provinces, tribes, and even generals began questioning whether loyalty to Rome was still worth it. Rome, once the center of the world, had become just another vulnerable city. This shift in perception was as lethal as any army, because an empire built on fear and prestige could not survive without them. In the decades that followed, the sack became a touchstone for both despair and reflection. Pagan writers like Zosimus lamented that abandoning the old gods had doomed the city, arguing that Christianity's rise had angered the divine protectors who once shielded Rome. Christian thinkers, meanwhile, pointed to the sparing of churches as evidence of providence, a sign that spiritual power now mattered more than worldly glory. These debates mattered because they shaped how people processed trauma. Was Rome's fall a divine punishment, a political failure, or simply the natural cycle of empires? Each explanation gave different meaning to the catastrophe, but all agreed on one truth. Rome was no longer untouchable. Ordinary citizens experienced the suck in raw, human terms. For the woman who lost her home in the Subura, or the senator who saw his villa stripped of treasures, it didn't matter whether the gods or emperors were to blame. What mattered was survival. Many were displaced, forced to flee into the countryside or rely on the generosity of the church for shelter. The sack created waves of refugees across Italy, straining already fragile resources. Those who lived through it told stories to their children. Stories of fear, of chaos, and of the night when Rome's proud streets belonged not to legions, but to foreign boots. For the Visigoths, the sack was both a triumph and a tragedy. On one hand, it proved they were a force to be reckoned with, no longer just wanderers at Rome's mercy. On the other, it did not provide the stability they craved. Rome yielded gold and slaves, but it could not provide the fertile lands they needed for their people. In this sense, the sack symbolized the contradictions of late antiquity. A world where victory did not guarantee security, and where even conquerors remained restless. The Visigoths would continue their migrations, shaping the map of Europe for centuries. But Rome's scars would always bear Alaric's name. The event also reshaped Rome's relationship with Constantinople. The Eastern Empire had long distanced itself from the troubles of the West, investing in its own defenses and prosperity. The sack of 410 reinforced this divide. Too many in the East. The fall of Rome confirmed what they already suspected, that the West was a sinking ship. Constantinople, with its walls and wealth, seemed like the true heir of empire. This geographic and political shift would define the next millennium, as Byzantium outlived its western twin by nearly 1,000 years. But for contemporaries, the contrast was stark. One capital burning, the other thriving. Cultural memory of the sack became a weapon in later centuries. Writers, theologians, and rulers invoked the tragedy to make their points. Christian leaders spoke of Rome's humiliation as proof that worldly power was fleeting compared to divine grace. Pagan traditionalists used it as a rallying cry against abandoning ancestral rituals. Politicians and generals pointed to it as a warning about complacency and weakness. Rome's burning thus became more than an event. It became a symbol, one endlessly reinterpreted, depending on the needs of the moment. Its flames never truly went out. They smoldered in memory and rhetoric. The psychological blow of the sack also shaped Rome's art and literature. Gone was the confident triumphalism of earlier centuries, replaced with a tone of mourning and fragility. Writers described the city as a widow, bereft of her protectors. Poets spoke of ashes and silence, where once there had been parades. Even architecture bore the scars, as damaged villas and temples were left standing as visible reminders of Rome's vulnerability. The sack became etched not only into chronicles, but into the very fabric of the city. The ghosts lingering over every forum and yet Rome did not collapse entirely. Part of its resilience came from its people, who rebuilt, adapted, and carried on despite everything. Markets reopened, senators resumed their debates, and the daily rhythm of life returned. Though forever changed, this persistence gave rise to a paradox. Rome was both broken and enduring. It had lost its aura of eternity, but it refused to die. This duality is what makes the sack so haunting. There was not a final ending, but a wound that never fully healed, reminding everyone that strength and fragility can coexist in the same city. In hindsight, historians see the sack as one of the defining moments of late antiquity, not because of the destruction alone, but because of the questions it raised. What holds societies together? How do myths of power shape reality? What happens when those myths are shattered? These questions remain relevant today, making the story of 410 AD more than just ancient history. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of all civilizations, a reminder that no matter how eternal they seem, they remain subject to time and human weakness. Even centuries later, when Rome would be sacked again by other forces, it was the events of 410 that lingered in collective memory. This was the first time the Eternal City had been breached in nearly 800 years. The first time its marble walls echoed not with triumph but with terror. Later disasters would add new layers of tragedy. But Alaric sack remained the symbol of Rome's lost innocence. It was the moment when the city's eternity cracked, when myth gave way to history, and when the eternal city learned it was, after all, mortal. The sack of 410 also exposed the fragility of Roman leadership. Emperor Honorius, who reigned during the catastrophe, was far removed from the crises. He sat in Ravenna, a fortified city surrounded by marshes, safe but detached. When messengers brought news that Rome had fallen, legend claims he misunderstood, thinking it was his pet chicken named Roma that had died, whether true or exaggerated. The story captures the disconnect between emperor and empire. Honorius embodied a leadership that was isolated, incapable of grasping the scale of the disaster. To the people of Rome, the absence of their emperor during their darkest hour was itself a betrayal. This absence of leadership deepened the sense of abandonment. Rome had always been more than buildings. It was an idea, a promise of protection under the aegis of empire. When its emperor ignored the city's suffering, that promise shattered. Citizens realized that loyalty to the empire did not guarantee security. The legions they had trusted were absent. The Senate was powerless, and their ruler had fled. This emotional rupture was more corrosive than the physical destruction. It planted seeds of disillusionment, convincing many that Rome's golden age was truly over. The empire might continue on paper, but its soul had been wounded. The sack also altered Rome's relationship with the provinces. For centuries, Rome had been the center to which taxes, soldiers, and grain flowed. The provinces gave Rome consumit, and in return, offered stability. After 410, that bargain looked hollow. Provincial governors saw that even the capital was vulnerable, and some began to act more independently. Local leaders looked less to Rome and more to their own armies or to nearby powers. The sack encouraged decentralization, accelerating the empire's fragmentation. Rome was still revered, but no longer relied upon in the same way. The eternal city's gravity had weakened. In art and memory, the sack became a recurring symbol of fragility. Christian writers described it as a cleansing fire, stripping away arrogance and pointing toward spiritual renewal. Pagan authors saw it as tragedy, a symbol of decline and betrayal. Both perspectives agreed on one thing: Rome had been changed forever. Temples that once symbolized divine favor now stood scarred, while basilicas gleamed as safe havens. The contrast in sacred spaces told a new story, one where power shifted from the old gods of stone to the new faith of the cross. In that sense, the sack marked not just a political shift, but a cultural transformation. For many Romans, the memory of those 3 days lingered in nightmares. Parents warned their children of foreign boots in the streets, and stories of treasures stolen filled conversations. Survivors carried scars that no rebuilding could erase. They remembered hiding in churches, watching flames rise from rooftops, or begging soldiers for mercy. For them, the sack was not an abstract event of politics or religion, but a lived trauma. This personal suffering mattered as much as the broader history. It humanized the fall of Rome, showing that behind grand narratives lay individuals whose lives were torn apart. The sack also inspired migration. Many wealthy Romans fled to safer regions, some to Constantinople, others to their country estates far from the city. Scholars and artists left as well, carrying with them fragments of Roman culture. In this way, the sack spread Rome ideas outward. Even as it weakened the capital, the city itself suffered, but Rome's cultural DNA continued to replicate across the Mediterranean. Ironically, the violence that humbled Rome also helped disperse its legacy, planting seeds that would outlast the empire itself. Politically, the sack forced the Western Empire into a new reality. Negotiations with so-called barbarians could no longer be dismissed. Alaric had proven that treaties, broken promises, and arrogance came with a cost. After 410, emperors had to take seriously the demands of groups like the Visit. This created a precedent. The empire was no longer the sole authority, but a partner in uneasy compromises. To some Romans, this was humiliation. To others, it was survival. Either way, the days of unilateral dominance were gone. Rome had entered an age of negotiation rather than command. The sack's timing was particularly symbolic. It occurred precisely as the old Roman world was giving way to what we now call the Middle Ages. The fall of the capital did not end Rome outright, but it marked a transition. Power became more regional, culture more diverse, and politics less centralized. The sack was thus both an ending and a beginning. For contemporaries, it felt like catastrophe. For historians, it represents transformation, the breaking of one world and the birth of another. The flames of 410 lit the path into a darker, more fragmented age. Legends also grew around the sack, embellishing its impact. Some stories claimed statues of the gods wept, or that sacred fires went out as Visigoths entered the city. Others imagined the Tiber itself running dark with ash. These tales reveal how Romans processed trauma by framing it in cosmic terms, as if the universe itself had mourned with them. Whether factual or not, such stories magnified the event. As a significance, the sack became mythologized almost instantly, not just remembered as history but as a moral tale about arrogance, hubris, and divine retribution. Ultimately, the sack of Rome in 410 reminds us of the delicate balance between power and perception. Rome was still vast, still wealthy, still technically an empire after the event, but perception matters. Once people believed the eternal city could fall, the empire's psychological shield was broken. Fear spread among citizens. Confidence faltered in the provinces, and enemies grew bolder. Rome remained a city, but no longer a symbol of eternity. Its marble walls still stood, but their meaning had changed forever. The day Rome burned was the day eternity itself cracked, revealing the fragility beneath the marble. The sack of 410 also reshaped how outsiders viewed Rome. For centuries, to be Roman meant to be superior, a conqueror, a builder of roads, a keeper of law. But when news reached neighboring kingdoms that Rome itself had been violated, the aura of invulnerability dissolved. Ambitious leaders among the Franks, Saxons, and Vandals began to see opportunity rather than intimidation. The sack was more than a humiliation. It was a signal flare. The eternal city had cracks in its armor, and those watching from afar knew the world was changing. For the first time in centuries, Rome looked less like destiny and more like prey. For Christians, the sack sparked theological debates that would shape the faith for centuries. Pagans blamed the abandonment of Jupiter, Mars, and the old gods. Christians countered that the churches spared by Alaric's men were proof of divine protection. Augustine of Hippo, living in North Africa, began writing The City of God as a direct response to the panic. His argument was clear. The fall of Rome was tragic, but it proved that earthly powers, no matter how mighty, were temporary. Only the spiritual city of God was eternal. This shift in perspective transformed the meaning of eternity itself. Away from Rome's marble and toward heaven's promise, the sack also marked a turning point in cultural memory. For centuries afterward, Romans would speak of before and after the flames. That became a dividing line in time, a moment when the old world ended and a new one began. Writers evoked the event as both warning and lament, a scar on the collective psyche. The grandeur of Rome was still visible in its arches and forums, but now those monuments looked less like eternal triumphs and more like relics of a greatness that had slipped away. The city remained, but the meaning of Rome had changed forever. Economically, the sack added to an already collapsing system. Rome's wealth was not only plundered but redistributed. Gold, silver, and treasures carried away by the Visigoths never returned, weakening the city's financial core. The aristocrats who lost their estates never regained their dominance, and common people found themselves more dependent on the church than on the Senate. Markets reopened, but confidence was shaken. Trade routes that once flowed effortlessly now hesitated. Fearing instability, the empire could recover some resources, but not the trust that underpinned them. Confidence, once Rome's strongest currency, had been spent and could not be restored. Militarily, the sack exposed Rome's hollow defenses, where once disciplined legions had stood. Mercenaries and underfunded troops now filled the ranks. The city's walls were strong, but walls mean little without soldiers willing to fight. Alaric had exploited this weakness masterfully, pressuring Rome with sieges until surrender seemed the only option. This vulnerability invited future invasions. Vandals, Ostrogoths, and others would later breach the Eternal City, emboldened by the precedent Alaric set. The sack was not just an isolated event, it was the opening of a door that would never close again. For survivors, the memory lingered in everyday life. Stories were told of soldiers bursting into homes, of treasures lost, of narrow escapes into some families kept relics of that time. A piece of broken pottery, a coin looted, and later returned as reminders of children who lived through the sack grew up in a Rome haunted by fear, their worldview shaped not by triumphal processions, but by the memory of vulnerability. These personal narratives, passed down through generations, gave the sack a human face that statistics and chronicles could never capture. The sack also transformed Rome's spiritual geography. Basilicas like St. Peter's became more than places of worship, they became symbols of resilience. To step inside was to remember not only the protection of faith, but the terror outside its doors. Temples that once dominated the skyline now looked diminished, their gods silent during the crisis. This reorientation of sacred space cemented Christianity's role as the spiritual anchor of the city. Rome the Empire was weakened, but Rome the Church was just beginning its ascent. In the broader sweep of history, the sack revealed a truth about empires. They do not collapse in one blow, but in a series of shocks that weaken the foundation until it crumbles. Alaric's sack was one such shock. Not final, but decisive. Rome would continue for decades, but the aura of invincibility was gone. The empire became a shadow of its former self, relying more on memory than on power. Intrigue 410 was less about destruction than about revelation. It revealed Rome's fragility to itself and to the world. As historians reflect on 4 and 10, they see it as a lesson in arrogance. Rome believed itself untouchable, and that belief blinded it to the real threats gathering at its borders. Alaric exploited not just military weakness but psychological complacency. The sack shows how dangerous myths can be when they prevent societies from adapting. Rome's belief in its own eternity made it careless, and that carelessness left its gates vulnerable. In the smoke of the burning city lies a warning for all civilizations. Eternity is a story, not a guarantee, and yet, the sack also ensured Rome's memory would never fade. Had the city never been breached, its story might have been one of endless triumphs, remembered but distant. Instead, its humiliation made it human. The Eternal City, humbled and scarred, became a mirror in which all later civilizations could see themselves. The ruins of Rome tell not only of glory but of fragility, not only of conquest but of collapse. And it is precisely this duality, eternally yet fragile, that keeps Rome alive in our imaginations to this day. The sack of 410 also marked the beginning of a cultural shift where people looked less to Rome's emperors for leadership and more to its bishops. The Emperor Honorius seemed powerless, hidden away in Ravenna, while church leaders in Rome offered sanctuary, food, and hope. In the eyes of many survivors, it was not the empire but the church that had saved them. This change accelerated the transfer of moral authority from state to religion, setting the stage for the church to rise as the true heir to Rome's legacy. Out of ashes, a new Rome was being born, not of marble and legions, but of altars and prayers. In Manuela's, the sack humanized the empire. For centuries, Rome had stood above the world, an untouchable giant, but the sack revealed Rome as a city of people, frightened, desperate, and fragile. This vulnerability connected Rome's fate to the struggles of ordinary humans everywhere. Citizens who once believed themselves chosen by destiny realized they were no different from others who had suffered conquest. This recognition of shared humanity made Rome's story more relatable, ensuring its fall would resonate not just as history, but as a cautionary tale of hubris and humility. Artists and writers who lived through the catastrophe sought to capture its meaning. Some painted vivid images of fire and looting, while others described Rome as a widow mourning her lost glory. Poets spoke of silence falling over one's busy streets, of triumphal arches overshadowed by grief. These cultural works preserve not just the facts of the sack but the emotions, despair, disbelief, and mourning. They ensured that the sack lived on not as a dry chronicle but as a felt experience, carried in words and art that echoed across centuries. Through them, the memory of 410 became eternal, The sack also altered the geography of power within the empire. After Rome's humiliation, more emphasis shifted to Ravenna, which became the western capital. Its marshy defenses made it safer, but it lacked the grandeur and symbolism of Rome. To many, this move symbolized retreat. The empire's heart no longer beat in the eternal city, but in a fortress designed to hide. The contrast was painful. Where Rome once projected confidence and magnificence, Ravenna embodied fear and survival. It was a capital for an empire on the defensive, and everyone knew it. For those outside the empire, the sack was both a warning and an invitation. Tribes that had once feared Rome now saw opportunity. If Rome could be breached, so could its the Vandals in North Africa, the Franks in Gaul, the Saxons across the seas. All watched closely. Alaric's triumph emboldened them, encouraging future invasions. The sack was not just an isolated blow, but the first in the series of dominoes that would topple Western Rome. In this way, the flames of 410 lit the path for centuries of upheaval, reshaping Europe forever. Yet, not all consequences were immediate. Many Romans tried to resume life as usual, convincing themselves the sack was a temporary wound. Markets reopened, senators met, and festivals resumed. But beneath the surface, fear lingered. People whispered about prophecies, omens, and divine wrath. The psychological impact of the sack endured long after the streets were cleared of ash. Every rumor of approaching armies rekindled old terrors. In this way, the sack became not only an event of history but a permanent shadow in the minds of Romans. The role of women in the sack is often overlooked, but their experiences reveal much about the trauma of 410. Many sought refuge in basilicas, clutching children and praying for mercy. Some were enslaved, carried away with the spoils. Others emerged as symbols of resilience, rebuilding families and communities in the aftermath. Their stories, though less recorded, remind us that history is not only about generals and emperors, but about the countless lives disrupted in silence. Through their endurance, Rome itself endured, reshaping itself around survival. For the Visigoths, the sack brought both glory and frustration. They had proven themselves stronger than the empire's defenses, but their victory did not bring lasting stability. Alaric still sought land for his people, still faced hunger, and still wandered without a permanent home. Rome's riches provided temporary relief, but not permanence. This reality highlights the paradox of the time. Neither Romans nor Goths found true security. Both were caught in a world where old structures were failing, and new ones were not yet born. The sack was as much a symptom of instability as it was a cause. Legends about Alaric's death added to the mythic aura of 410. Just months after the sack, he died unexpectedly. His men, it is said, diverted a river to bury him beneath its waters, sealing his grave with Rome's treasures. Then they killed the slaves who built the tomb, ensuring its secret would remain. Whether fact or legend, the story reflects the awe with which contemporaries viewed Alaric. He was not merely a conqueror, but a figure woven into destiny. A man who humbled the eternal city and left the world forever changed. Ultimately, the sack of Rome in 410 was not about the destruction of a city, but about the destruction of an idea. Rome the city endured, but Rome the eternal myth did not. For centuries, people had believed in its permanence, its divine favor, its unshakable walls. Alaric's triumph proved otherwise. That revelation altered history. Empires would rise and fall in Rome's shadow, but none would forget the lesson of 410. That even the mightiest are fragile, and eternity is never guaranteed. The day Rome burned became the day the world learned that nothing lasts forever. The sack of Rome in 410 also shook the identity of Romans living far from the capital. In distant provinces like Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa, the event sent shockwaves. Local communities that had once looked to Rome as their cultural and political anchor began questioning whether allegiance to the empire still mattered. Governors worried about their own safety. Soldiers wondered whether their pay would continue. And ordinary farmers whispered that Rome's gods had turned away. For the first time in centuries, loyalty to Rome no longer felt like a guarantee of protection. The sack created not just physical destruction, but cracks in the emotional bond between the empire and its people. Philosophers, poets, and chroniclers wrestled with the meaning of this catastrophe. Some saw it as divine punishment, others as a historical inevitability. To the Christian scholar Jerome, living in Bethlehem, news of the sack drove him into despair. He wrote that the light of the world had been extinguished. His words capture the grief of a generation that had equated Rome with civilization itself. The sack forced thinkers to separate the empire from the idea of human progress. Civilization, they realized, could survive outside of Rome. But for many, that recognition felt like betrayal, as if the soul of humanity itself had been wounded. In the immediate aftermath, the city tried to return to normalcy, but scars remained visible everywhere. Monuments still stood, but their treasures were gone. Noble houses reopened, but their wealth had been stripped. Families carried on, but their stories were filled with fear. The sack transformed daily life into a struggle for resilience. Even mundane acts, lighting lamps, shopping in markets, attending worship, became infused with memory. The sound of Visigoth boots and the smell of smoke lingered in people's minds long after the flames had died. Rome sorbived, but its heartbeat had changed. The sack also altered how outsiders imagined Rome. For centuries, travelers had written about the city's majesty, its marble forums, its temples gleaming in the sun. After 410, descriptions changed. Rome was still grand, but it was now described as wounded, humbled, scarred. The contrasts fascinated later generations of writers, who saw in Rome's fall a metaphor for the fleeting nature of human achievement. Tourists who came to Rome in later centuries did not just see monuments. They saw ruins, and in those ruins, they saw the story of fragility as much as of greatness. The city became both a wonder and a warning. Politically, the sack demonstrated the empire's dependence on compromise. In earlier centuries, Rome had dictated terms. Now, it negotiated with the very peoples it once dismissed as barbarians. The Visigoths were no longer outsiders, begging at the gates. They were players in the imperial system, capable of forcing emperors to acknowledge their demands. This shift was monumental. Rome's supremacy had been based on dominance, not dialogue. But after 410, dialogue became survival. It was humiliating, but it was also unavoidable. This dependence on outsiders weakened the empire's core, eroding its authority from within. Economically, the aftermath deepened inequality. The rich, though looted, still retained land and influence, while the poor bore the brunt of instability. Grain shipments from Africa were disrupted, taxes became harsher, and inflation worsened. Many citizens fell into debt or servitude. The sack did not cause this inequality, but it made it more visible and more unbearable. As faith in the empire's ability to provide stability declined, people increasingly turned to local patrons, landowners, and bishops for support. The empire's centralized economy fractured into smaller, local networks of survival. Rome was no longer the unquestioned center of wealth. The sack also left an enduring mark on collective memory. Romans prided themselves on storytelling, and the trauma of 410 became a tale told at hearts, forums, and parents warned children about arrogance. Poets lamented the city's humiliation, and priests preached about divine lessons. In time, these stories blended history with myth, ensuring the sack would never be forgotten. Even centuries later, when Rome fell again to other invaders, people remembered Alaric's sack as the original wound. The first time the eternal city bled, it was a scar engraved into the soul of Europe. For Alaric and the Visigoths, the sack was both victory and tragedy. They had proven themselves powerful enough to shake the empire, yet they remained one without secure land. Their triumph felt hollow. Alaric himself would not live long enough to see his people settle in Gaul and Spain. His death shortly after the sack cast a shadow over his victory. As if fate itself denied him the fruits of conquest, the Visigoths moved on, but their place in history was sealed. They were forever the people who humbled Rome, and Alaric, the man who broke eternity. The sack also helped define the Middle Ages before the Middle Ages had truly begun. Scholars today see 410 as a threshold moment, where the ancient world gave way to something new. The structures of empire, centralized authority, reliance on legions, faith in imperial eternity, all cracked in that year. What replaced them was a patchwork of local powers, spiritual authority, and shifting alliances to those who lived through it. This transformation was terrifying, but to us, it marks the birth of a medieval Europe, one no longer ruled solely from Rome, but from countless smaller centers of power. Looking back, the sack of 410 is not remembered only as a disaster, but as a lesson. It reminds us that greatness is not permanent, that power without adaptability is fragile, and that myths of eternity can blind societies to real dangers. Rome thought itself eternal, but it was not. Yet in its fragility, Rome became more human, more relatable, and perhaps more enduring in memory. The day the eternal city burned was the day history itself gained one of its most powerful stories. A story not of eternity, but of fragility, survival, and transformation. The sack of 410 also forced Rome to confront its own contradictions. For centuries, it had prided itself on bringing order to chaos, civilization to wilderness. Yet in the moment of crisis, it was Rome itself that descended into chaos. The Visigoths did not just plunder its treasures, they exposed the hypocrisy of a city that claimed to rule the world, but could not protect its own citizens. For Romans, this realization was devastating. The empire had built an identity around superiority, and now that mask had been ripped away. The sack was as much about exposing truth as it was about causing destruction. One of the most haunting aspects of the sack was its restraint. Unlike other invasions in history, Alaric did not order the city to be razed. He spared the basilicas, ordered respect for sacred spaces, and left much of the city standing. In this way, the sack was symbolic. It was not about destroying Rome physically, but about destroying its myth. The eternal city survived, but it could never again claim to be eternal. The restraint itself made the event more powerful. The Visigoths proved their point without obliterating the city, showing that Rome's true weakness lay not in its walls, but in its spirit. The sack also changed the relationship between Romans and their history. Before 410, they had celebrated their past with triumphal arches, epic poems, and lavish festivals. Afterward, history became a burden, a reminder of what had been lost. Citizens could no longer walk past the Forum without remembering the boots of foreign soldiers marching across it. They could not enter the Colosseum without imagining the silence that followed the flames. Rome's monuments no longer symbolized confidence, they symbolized fragility. The past, once a source of pride, had become a shadow that haunted the present. For later generations, the sack became a narrative of morality. Writers used it to warn against arrogance, complacency, and neglect. Political leaders invoked it to justify reforms, while church leaders used it to argue for spiritual renewal. The sack became less about the facts of 3 days in 410 and more about the lessons drawn from them. It was transformed into a cautionary tale, retold across centuries, adapted to new contexts. Rome's suffering became humanity's parable, ensuring that its pain was not forgotten, but repurposed. The sack also gave birth to legends that blurred the line between history and myth. Stories circulated of treasures hidden beneath the Tiber, of gods weeping in their temples, of omens appearing in the sky. These tales may not have been true, but they captured the emotional truth of the event. That Rome's fall felt cosmic, as if the universe itself had shifted. Legends helped people process the trauma, giving shape to feelings that facts alone could not contain. Through myth, the sack gained an aura larger than life, embedding itself in cultural memory, far beyond the walls of the city. In practical terms, the sack accelerated the decline of the Western Empire. Provinces already restless began to break away more quickly. Resources were harder to gather, armies harder to maintain, and loyalty harder to demand. The sack had weakened not just Rome's defenses, but its reputation. Once the provinces saw that Rome could not protect itself, why should they continue to sacrifice for it? The sack did not topple the empire overnight, but it sped up the unraveling of ties that had already grown thin. Rome's world was shrinking, and everyone knew it. Psychologically, the sack cast a long shadow over Roman identity. To be Roman once meant belonging to something eternal, something greater than time. After 410, that identity fractured. People began to see themselves less as Romans and more as locals. Italians, Africans, Gauls. The unifying myth of Rome weakened, replaced by smaller, regional identities. This shift laid the groundwork for the medieval world, where kingdoms, tribes, and local lords mattered more than the empire. The sack, in this sense, was the moment Rome's unity began dissolving from the inside out. The sack also changed how other civilizations viewed history itself. Previously, Rome had been the model, the empire that lasted, the power that seemed unstoppable. After 410, history looked different. If Rome could fall, then perhaps no empire was safe. This realization shaped political thought in Byzantium, in Persia, and later in medieval Europe. Leaders began to see their rule not as guaranteed but as fragile. The sack turned Rome from an example of permanence into an example of impermanence, rewriting the lessons of history for centuries to come. In personal terms, the sack left behind countless untold stories. The merchant who lost his goods, the farmer who fled into the city for protection, the child who grew up remembering the flames. Their lives became part of a collective trauma. Though chroniclers wrote about senators and generals, the reality of the sack was lived in small moments of fear, hunger, and resilience. These human stories remind us that history is not just about great events, but about ordinary lives caught in extraordinary circumstances. Rome's fragility was written not only in chronicles but in tears. Ultimately, the sack of 410 reminds us that civilizations are built not just on walls and armies but on trust, faith, and belief. When those collapse, even the strongest empire can falter. Rome burned not because its walls were weak, but because its spirit was. The Visigoths revealed what Rome had long tried to hide, that eternity was a story, and stories can be read. The day Rome burned was the day the world learned that fragility is as much a part of history as glory. And in that paradox, eternal yet fragile, lies the enduring legacy of the eternal city. The sack of Rome in 410 also revealed how fragile the empire's alliances had become. For decades, Rome had relied on treaties with groups like the Visigoths, using them as soldiers while denying them equality. Alaric's invasion proved that such arrangements could not last forever. The Visigoths were not simply auxiliaries. They were a nation in search of a home, a people demanding recognition. By ignoring their needs, Rome had created the very enemy that breached its gates. The sack was a reminder that arrogance in diplomacy is as dangerous as weakness in battle. Even the natural world seemed to reflect the mood of the sack. Contemporary writers described the skies darkening with smoke, the air heavy with ash, and the Tiber River carrying debris from looted homes. These descriptions, whether literal or exaggerated, capture how Romans experienced the event, as if the entire universe was mourning. For citizens who had once believed Rome was blessed by heaven, the sense of abandonment was overwhelming. The gods, old or new, seemed silent, leaving the eternal city to burn without divine rescue. That silence may have been the most frightening part of all. The sack also shaped the identity of Christianity in profound ways. The sparing of churches gave believers a sense of vindication, a belief that their God had protected them when Rome's legions could not. Bishops became the city's moral anchors, offering hope where emperors offered none. This shift accelerated Christianity's transformation from a persecuted faith to the dominant force in European culture. The sack, paradoxically, weakened Rome politically, but strengthened it spiritually. Out of destruction came rebirth. Not of empire, but of the church that would one day rule from the same city. Economically, the sack devastated confidence. Rome's wealth had always drawn merchants, artisans, and migrants. But after 410, the flow slowed. Who wanted to risk their fortunes in a city that could not defend itself? Gold and silver were carried away, slaves and artisans dispersed, and trade routes wavered. The loss of treasure mattered less than the loss of trust. Rome was no longer the safe marketplace of the world. The city's economy never fully recovered, forcing power to shift gradually toward Constantinople and other regional centers. For Rome's aristocracy, the humiliation was unbearable. Families that had traced their lineage back to the Republic saw their villas stripped, their treasures looted, and their influence diminished. Many retreated into nostalgia, writing of Rome's past glories, while ignoring the present decay. Some fled eastward, seeking safety in Constantinople. Others tried to rebuild their authority locally, but the aura of superiority was gone. For the first time, aristocrats faced the same terror as commoners, hiding in basilicas, begging for mercy. The sack had erased the barrier between rich and poor, showing that in the face of history, all Romans could be humbled. Among the ordinary people, resilience became the only option. Families rebuilt their homes, merchants reopened shops, and life staggered forward. But the memory of the sack haunted every corner of daily life. Children grew up hearing stories of fire and chaos, shaping a generation more cautious and fearful. For them, Rome was not just marble and triumph, but also smoke and loss. This cultural memory lived on, ensuring the sack remained part of the city's identity long after the ruble was cleared. Rome survived, but never with the same innocence. The sack also raised questions about leadership itself. What did it mean to be emperor when the capital could fall? Honorius remained on the throne, but his authority was hollow. Real power lay with generals, bishops, and even foreign kings. The sack stripped the imperial title of its mystique, exposing the emperor as just another mortal, unable to protect his people. In this way, the sack began the slow erosion of the imperial idea itself. The emperor was no longer sacred, he was vulnerable, like Rome itself. In later centuries, the sack became a symbol used by both sides of faith and politics to Christians. It was proof that Rome's eternity was not in its empire, but in its church. To pagans, it was evidence that abandoning the old gods had brought divine wrath. To politicians, it was a warning about complacency. The same event carried different meanings, depending on who told the story. This malleability gave the sack a strange immortality. It became not just an event of history, but a narrative constantly reshaped to serve new purposes. The sack also reminds us that history is experienced unevenly. For the wealthy senator, it meant the loss of treasures. For the poor widow, it meant hunger and displacement. For the soldier, it meant humiliation. For the bishop, it meant opportunity to guide souls. Each perspective was valid. Each added to the mosaic of memory. Together, they reveal that the sack was not a single story, but countless ones woven together. To understand 410, we must see it not only from the top, but also from the streets. Only then does its full meaning emerge. Looking back, the sack of Rome in 410 stands as a moment of paradox. It destroyed the illusion of eternity, yet gave Rome a new kind of immortality. The immortality of memory. The eternal city proved fragile, but in that fragility, it became timeless. Its survival after humiliation, its ability to carry on despite loss, made it more human, and because it was human, its story endured. Rome's eternity was never in its walls or its wealth, but in its ability to be remembered. The day Rome burned ensured that it would never truly die. The sack of Rome in 410 closed one chapter of history and opened another. For contemporaries, it felt like the end of the world. But for us, it looks more like a turning point. Rome was humbled, but not erased. It was wounded, but not destroyed. The city's survival, even in scarred form, ensured its story would outlast the empire itself. The sack is a reminder that endings are rarely absolute. What seems like collapse in the moment often becomes transformation in hindsight. Rome did not die in 410. It changed into something new. For the empire, though, the sack left wounds that never healed. Trust in imperial protection was shattered. Loyalty in the provinces weakened, and confidence in eternity dissolved. The Western Empire staggered on 4 decades, but each step was slower, weaker, more desperate. The sack had pulled away the curtain, exposing the truth. Rome was no longer invincible. The decline that followed was not sudden but steady, like a candle burning down. And yet, the memory of 410 gave meaning to this decline, turning weakness into lesson. In the centuries that followed, the sack inspired countless reflections. Monks in monasteries copied stories of the event. Poets turned it into verse, and theologians used it as proof of their arguments. The sack lived on, not just as history, but as narrative. It became a mirror for later generations, a way to understand their own crises. Every time a city fell, people thought back to Rome. Every time an empire wavered, they remembered 410. Rome's burning became universal, not just Roman. Even today, the sack resonates in unexpected ways. When we speak of great powers collapsing, when we imagine the fragility of civilizations, we invoke Rome. The flames of 410 burn in our collective imagination as both warning and fascination. They remind us that human achievement, no matter how glorious, is never immune to time. But they also remind us of resilience. Because Rome survived, scarred but enduring, the eternal city proved fragile, but it also proved the figure of Alaric looms large in this memory. To some, he was a villain, the destroyer of civilization. To others, he was a realist, forcing Rome to face its own failures. His sack of Rome was not senseless destruction, but a demand for recognition, a plea for justice ignored too long. History remembers him not only as the man who humbled Rome, but as the man who revealed its humanity. Without Alaric, Rome might have continued believing its own myths. With him, the world saw the truth. The sack also reminds us of the importance of perspective. To Romans, it was catastrophe. To the Visigoths, it was survival. To later Christians, it was divine proof. To historians, it was transition. Each lens adds a layer of meaning, showing that history is never one story but many. This multiplicity is what makes the sack so powerful. It resists simple interpretation. It is tragedy and transformation, humiliation and rebirth, fragility and endurance. All at once, for those who lived through it, the sack was not history but life. It was hunger, fear, loss, and endurance. It was watching homes burn, hearing temples collapse, and finding shelter in sacred spaces. These experiences shaped a generation, leaving marks deeper than any chronicler could record. The true story of 410 is not only written in books, but in memories passed quietly among families. It was a human story before it became a historical one. In time, Rome rebuilt, but never again with the same confidence. The monuments stood, but their meanings had changed. Arches once celebrating victory now looked like echoes of a lost past. Forums that once buzzed with politics became quiet reminders of fragility. Rome endured, but as a different kind of city. One defined not by unshakable dominance, but by survival against all odds. And in that survival lay its greatest legacy. The sack of 410 is remembered today not simply because it was dramatic, but because it speaks to something universal. All civilizations tell themselves they are eternal, or imagine they will last forever. Rome believed that more than most, and yet it burned. The story matters because it humbles us, reminding us that eternity is an illusion, but it also inspires, showing that even in fragility, there is resilience. The eternal city burned, but it still stands. That paradox is what makes its story timeless. In the end, the day Rome burned was not the end of Rome but the end of certainty. It was the moment eternity cracked, revealing the fragile human truths beneath, and perhaps that is why the sack of 410 still matters. It tells us that greatness is fragile, but fragility itself can become greatness when remembered. Rome's eternity was never in its walls or legions, but in its story. And that story, eternal yet fragile, continues to burn bright across the centuries, a flame that time itself cannot extinguish.